When you hear Western leaders praising an African president, listen closely because sometimes praise hides something else entirely. If one day you hear Europeans and Americans praise me, know that I have betrayed you. Pan-Africanist leader of Burkina Faso once warned, and his words are coming back into the spotlight today. In Washington, U.S. President Donald Trump praised the presidents of Nigeria and the Democratic Republic of Congo, calling them courageous and wonderful leaders in front of journalists and diplomats after signing a peace deal that he claims will transform regional stability. Trump spoke warmly about the historic pact and American investments tied to it, including a new economic framework designed to expand U.S. business access to mineral resources in the Congo and neighboring states. On social media, news of Trump's praise spread rapidly. Many Africans, especially young activists and Pan-African voices, accused the Nigerian president Bola Ahmed Tinubu and the Congolese president Félix Tshisekedi of betraying the continent by aligning too closely with Western interests. Some online commenters claimed the praise meant the leaders were acting as puppets for foreign powers, decisions shaped more by Western economic deals than by the needs of their people. In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, the atmosphere was tense. Ibrahim Traoré, the president known for his Pan-African rhetoric and resistance to Western influence, listened to the unfolding headlines in silence. Some analysts see him as one of the few African leaders who has consistently opposed neo-colonial economic policies and called for self-determination and sovereignty across the continent. Traoré remembered the warning often attributed to past African revolutionaries that praise from former colonial powers might be a sign of betrayal. Many Burkinabe felt vindicated, pointing to Traoré's repeated calls for African unity and independence from foreign political agendas. Unlike others who welcomed Western partnerships, Traoré had focused on homegrown solutions, decentralizing foreign military presence and resisting dependency on Western institutions. Analysts have noted that his anti-Western and Pan-African stance has made him both controversial and popular among segments of the African public. Critics of Trump's remarks argue that praising African leaders, mainly for cooperation with U.S. business and strategic interests, says more about Washington's objectives than about the progress of African nations. Observers suggest that if a leader were to challenge Western interests too openly, the same Western press would soon brand them a dictator or unstable, regardless of their domestic legitimacy or popular support. Some analysts point to historical patterns where leaders who resisted Western economic influence later faced political isolation or destabilization campaigns. Similar fates have been discussed in relation to leaders like Venezuela's Nicolás Maduro or Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, not necessarily because of their policies, but because they refused to align with Western economic agendas. In the streets of Burkina Faso, ordinary citizens watched live broadcasts of Trump's remarks. Many felt uneasy as headlines splashed praise for foreign leaders who had opened their nation's natural resources to American companies. Online groups lit up with debates, hashtags like #AfricaFirst and #NoPuppets trending as critics argued that praise from Western capitals had historically been a sign that a leader had shifted away from defending African autonomy. Meanwhile, supporters of Traoré shared clips of his past speeches, calling for African unity, self-reliance, and resistance to neo-colonial influence, messages that resonated deeply with many Africans weary of seeing their resources exploited with little benefit for local populations. And as the discussion spread across social media platforms, many young Africans began echoing the words of their own leaders from history. If the West praises you, check whose interests you serve. The morning after the headlines from Washington spread across Africa, radio stations in Ouagadougou replayed the clip again and again. In the video, Donald Trump smiled confidently before reporters. "They work with us," he said of Bola Ahmed Tinubu and Félix Tshisekedi. "They love my government. We signed everything I wanted." The phrase echoed far beyond Washington. Signed everything I wanted. In markets across Burkina Faso, people paused to debate what that truly meant. Was it diplomacy, partnership, or surrender? In the presidential palace in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré sat at a long wooden table with his closest advisors. No television cameras, no microphones, just silence. One advisor broke it. "Mr. President, social media is exploding. Many are comparing those remarks to the warning of Thomas Sankara." At the mention of Thomas Sankara, the room grew heavier. "If one day you hear that the West praises me," Sankara had once warned, "know that I have betrayed you." Traoré leaned back slowly. "Praise," he said quietly, "is not always honor. Sometimes it is confirmation of obedience." Across Africa, analysts were offering sharp commentary. Some argued that the so-called historic peace agreement and mining deals would bring investment and development. Others insisted that the real beneficiaries would be foreign corporations securing access to cobalt, lithium, gold, and rare earth minerals. In Kinshasa, supporters of Félix Tshisekedi defended him fiercely, saying stability required partnerships. In Abuja, backers of Bola Ahmed Tinubu argued that Nigeria needed strong global alliances. But in Ouagadougou, the mood was different. Burkina Faso had taken a more confrontational path toward Western influence in recent years. The young military leader Traoré had built his image around sovereignty, resource control, and Pan-African cooperation, independent of former colonial powers. And because of that stance, he had also faced criticism. Foreign commentators labeled him reckless. Some African leaders quietly mocked him. A senior diplomat from another West African country was quoted anonymously, saying, "He is inexperienced. He does not understand global politics." But in the streets of Burkina Faso, young people carried a different message. They wore shirts with Traoré's image. They shared videos of his speeches calling for economic independence. They spoke of dignity. Inside the palace, an aide entered hurriedly. "Mr. President, some foreign media outlets are framing you as isolated compared to the leaders praised in Washington." Traoré smiled slightly. "Isolated?" he repeated. He stood and walked toward the window overlooking the city. "Sometimes," he said calmly, "standing alone is the cost of standing firm." An advisor asked carefully, "Do you plan to respond publicly to Trump's remarks?" Traoré paused. "No," he said after a moment. "We do not chase validation." He turned back toward the table. "Our responsibility is not to be praised in Washington. Our responsibility is to be respected in Ouagadougou." Outside, youth groups had begun organizing online discussions titled, "Who Truly Represents Africa?" Clips comparing Trump's praise with Sankara's warning were going viral. One trending post read, "When America claps for you, check your contracts." Meanwhile, international analysts speculated that Washington's praise reflected strategic calculations securing mineral supply chains in competition with other global powers. But in Burkina Faso, the narrative was emotional, not technical. It was about memory, about Patrice Lumumba, about Muammar Gaddafi, about leaders who challenged Western dominance and paid heavy prices. Whether one agreed with those comparisons or not, the symbolism carried weight. Late that evening, Traoré addressed a small gathering of university students, not a grand speech, just a discussion. One student stood and asked boldly, "Mr. President, what if one day America praises you?" The room held its breath. Traoré answered slowly, "If they praise me for defending Burkina Faso's sovereignty, that is their choice," he said. "But if they praise me because I surrendered it, then you must hold me accountable." Applause erupted. Not loud, not staged. Real. Across Africa, debate continued to intensify. Some saw pragmatism in cooperation. Others saw compromise. But one thing was undeniable. Trump's praise had drawn a sharp line across the continent between leaders who sought alignment and those who championed resistance. And in that divide, Ibrahim Traoré's image only grew stronger among those who believed Africa's future should not be negotiated in foreign capitals. The question now was not about praise. It was about power. Who controls Africa's resources? Who shapes its destiny? And who answers to its people? The debate had only just begun. The debate did not cool down. It burned hotter. Television studios across Africa hosted heated panels. Some analysts praised cooperation with global powers as smart diplomacy. Others warned that Africa had seen this pattern before, agreements signed with smiles, then decades of extraction with little transformation. In Ouagadougou, crowds gathered in Republic Square, holding Burkinabe flags. They were not protesting. They were not celebrating. They were watching the continent, watching their leaders, watching history. Inside the presidential office, Ibrahim Traoré received a report detailing the newly announced mining framework connected to Washington's praise. The document outlined infrastructure commitments, security guarantees, and export terms. He read it slowly. "Where," he asked quietly, "are the clauses guaranteeing local processing?" An aide flipped through the summary. "There are promises of job creation, Mr. President, but mineral refining would largely occur abroad." Traoré closed the file. "That," he said firmly, "is the difference." Later that evening, he called for a national address. No dramatic music, no grand stage, just a podium and the flag of Burkina Faso behind him. "My fellow Africans," he began calmly, "today there is much talk about praise from powerful nations. Across the continent, people tuned in. He did not attack anyone by name. He did not insult. He did not threaten. Instead, he spoke about memory. He spoke about how Africa exports raw gold and imports finished jewelry, how it exports crude minerals and imports expensive batteries, how it exports cocoa and imports chocolate. We cannot celebrate contracts that keep us suppliers of raw wealth while others control the value," he said. Social media erupted again. Supporters called him courageous. Critics accused him of grandstanding. But Traoré continued. "If partnerships are equal, we welcome them. If agreements uplift our workers, protect our land, and build our industries, we welcome them. But if praise comes because we surrender control of our future, then that praise is not an honor." In Washington, journalists replayed his speech and described it as a subtle rebuttal to Donald Trump, without directly naming him. Meanwhile, in Nigeria and the Democratic Republic of Congo, reactions were mixed. Some commentators defended Bola Ahmed Tinubu and Félix Tshisekedi, arguing that international partnerships were necessary for economic growth. Others questioned whether the deals guaranteed fair returns for citizens. But in Burkina Faso, something powerful was happening. Young engineers began discussing local refining plants. University students proposed continental trade alliances. Entrepreneurs talked about processing gold domestically instead of exporting it raw. The conversation had shifted. It was no longer just about Trump's praise. It was about Africa's blueprint. Days later, a regional summit was held in West Africa. Several presidents attended. The atmosphere was polite but tense. Some leaders avoided Traoré's gaze. Others greeted him cautiously. During a closed-door session, one president remarked, "We must be realistic. The global system is what it is." Traoré responded calmly. "The global system changes when nations demand change." Silence filled the room. He continued, "We cannot complain about exploitation if we sign agreements that guarantee it." A few leaders shifted uncomfortably. Outside the summit, young Africans waved banners reading, "Africa is not for sale." International media framed the moment as a growing ideological divide within African leadership, pragmatists versus sovereignty advocates. But on the ground, it felt deeper. It felt generational. A new wave of African youth was questioning long-standing economic models. They were not rejecting global trade. They were demanding fairness. In Ouagadougou, an elderly man watching the news turned to his grandson. "When I was young," he said softly, "we believed independence meant freedom. Now you must make sure freedom means ownership." That night, Traoré walked alone through a quiet section of the city, accompanied only by minimal security. He looked at the streets, at the people, at the future. Praise from powerful capitals might come or not come. Criticism might grow louder. But what mattered most was not applause from abroad. It was trust at home. And in that moment, one truth became clear. Leadership in Africa was no longer measured only by foreign recognition. It was measured by who controlled the contracts, who protected the workers, who ensured that when Africa's soil gave gold, its people received prosperity. The storm of debate would continue, but the message had been sent. Africa was watching, and this time, it was asking harder questions. If you followed this story from the beginning, then you already know this was never just about praise from Washington. It was about power. It was about resources. It was about who defines Africa's future. And now, the moment of reckoning had arrived. In the days after his address, Ibrahim Traoré did something unexpected. He did not attack. He did not escalate. He did not insult fellow African presidents. Instead, he announced a policy paper titled Value Before Volume. The proposal was simple but radical. No strategic mineral exports without a roadmap for local processing. Majority local workforce requirements in extraction projects. Transparent contract disclosures to parliamentary oversight. Regional African partnerships before external dependency. The document spread across universities, economic forums, and policy circles. Young economists dissected it. Pan-African activists amplified it. International investors watched it. And then came the reaction. From Washington, reporters asked Donald Trump whether Traoré's comments were directed at the United States. Trump shrugged during a press gaggle. "We have great relationships with many African leaders. Some want to work with us, some talk a lot. We'll see who delivers." The remark was subtle, but analysts knew what it meant. In Abuja, supporters of Bola Ahmed Tinubu defended the mining agreements, arguing that foreign capital accelerates development. Government officials emphasized infrastructure funding, security partnerships, and promised industrial parks. In Kinshasa, spokespeople for Félix Tshisekedi insisted the U.S.-Africa mining deal would stabilize the region and create jobs. The continent now had two visible approaches: strategic partnership with Western powers under existing global trade systems. Resource nationalism focused on internal industrialization before export. The debate intensified, but here is what no one expected. At the African Union Policy Forum weeks later, several mid-sized African nations quietly signaled interest in reviewing their mineral frameworks. Not publicly, not dramatically, but cautiously. Privately, ministers admitted, there is growing public pressure. In Senegal, students organized economic literacy workshops. In Ghana, local commentators revisited historic mining contracts. In Kenya, business leaders began discussing battery manufacturing possibilities tied to regional lithium and cobalt supply chains. This was no longer about personalities. It was structural. Meanwhile, whispers circulated in diplomatic corridors. Some leaders felt Traoré was embarrassing them. Some feared his rhetoric would unsettle foreign investors. A few quietly admired his boldness but worried about consequences. History loomed over every conversation. The names were unspoken but understood. Patrice Lumumba, Muammar Gaddafi, Nicolás Maduro, leaders who confronted global power structures and paid heavy prices. But Traoré was careful. He framed his message not as rebellion, but as recalibration, not anti-West, but pro-Africa, not isolation, but negotiation from strength. One evening, during a town hall in Ouagadougou, a young woman stood up and asked him directly, "Mr. President, what happens if powerful countries turn against us?" The room went silent. He paused before answering. "They already respect strength," he said calmly. "And strength begins with unity and competence." He continued, "If Africa manages its resources responsibly, educates its youth, and builds industry, no nation can humiliate us." Applause filled the hall, not because of anger, but because of aspiration. International markets reacted cautiously. Some investors hesitated. Others saw opportunity in local industrial partnerships. The narrative abroad shifted from radical leader to emerging economic nationalist. But at home the conversation was deeper. Taxi drivers debated mineral royalties. Teachers explained supply chains. Farmers discussed fertilizer production linked to phosphate deposits. The people were thinking economically, and that changed everything. Meanwhile, social media remained divided. Some accused certain African presidents of prioritizing Western approval. Others warned against turning geopolitics into emotional battles. But one fact was undeniable. The praise from Washington had triggered a continental introspection. And the quote that started it all echoed louder than ever. "If one day you hear Europeans and the West praising me, know that I have betrayed you." Whether one agreed or disagreed with the interpretation, it forced a question into every political discussion. Who truly benefits? In the final scene of this chapter, Traore met privately with a coalition of young African entrepreneurs. They presented him with a proposal, a regional mineral processing consortium led by African engineers. He studied the proposal, smiled. "This," he said quietly, "is the answer. Not speeches, not praise, not condemnation, but capacity." The storm was far from over. Global powers would continue to compete for Africa's wealth. African leaders would continue to choose different paths. Critics would challenge. Supporters would defend. But something irreversible had happened. The continent was asking harder questions, not about who is praised, but about who profits. Not about who smiles at foreign cameras, but about who signs contracts behind closed doors. And in that shift, in that awakening, lay the real story. Not one man versus another, not one president versus Washington, but Africa negotiating its place in a changing world. The chapter closes. The debate continues. The continent decides. The speeches were over. The applause had faded. Now came the part. History always tests pressure. Across diplomatic circles, discussions intensified. The debate that began with a single quote had evolved into policy drafts, strategic alignments, and quiet negotiations. At the headquarters of the African Union in Addis Ababa, emergency economic consultations were scheduled behind closed doors. Officially, it was about continental supply chain resilience. Unofficially, everyone knew why. The mineral question had exploded. In Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré convened a council of economists, engineers, and legal scholars. Not just politicians, technicians. He placed a simple question on the table. If Africa stopped exporting raw lithium tomorrow, what would happen? The room filled with projections, short-term losses, investor backlash, currency fluctuations, but also long-term industrial leverage, regional bargaining power, domestic job expansion. One young metallurgist stood up and said, "We don't need to stop exports, we need to restructure them." That line became the new strategy. Meanwhile, international outlets began running headlines. Is resource nationalism returning to Africa? Financial markets reacted cautiously, but not chaotically. Investors were not fleeing, they were recalculating. In Washington, policy advisors debated whether the growing rhetoric signaled risk or negotiation tactics. Some argued cooperation could adapt. Others warned that allowing stricter local conditions might inspire similar demands in other regions. No one was dismissing the shift anymore. In West Africa, the Economic Community of West African States quietly scheduled a technical review of cross-border mineral infrastructure. Publicly, it was routine. Privately, ministers admitted the pressure from citizens was real. Youth organizations were no longer talking only about ideology. They were presenting spreadsheets. They were asking, how much cobalt leaves annually? How much tax revenue remains locally? How many refining plants operate domestically? The questions were specific. That made them powerful, but not everyone was pleased. Several African presidents worried that confrontational rhetoric, even indirect, might destabilize foreign partnerships. One leader was overheard saying, "We cannot afford to scare away capital." Another replied, "We cannot afford to scare away our own future." The divide was no longer loud. It was philosophical. Back in Burkina Faso, Traoré delivered another address, shorter this time. "No African leader should be humiliated abroad," he said. But neither should Africa be humiliated economically. He avoided naming names. He avoided accusations. He focused on dignity. That word echoed. Dignity in contracts. Dignity in labor. Dignity in ownership. Then, something unexpected happened. A consortium of African entrepreneurs announced a feasibility study for a regional battery manufacturing hub, funded not by Western corporations alone, but through a hybrid model combining African sovereign funds, private investors, and technical partnerships. The announcement changed the tone. The debate was no longer West versus Africa. It became extraction versus transformation. International commentators began reframing the narrative. Instead of portraying a clash of personalities, they described an emerging African economic doctrine, one prioritizing value retention. Even critics acknowledged one thing: the conversation had matured. This was no longer emotional outrage triggered by praise from abroad. It was structural introspection. Yet tension simmered beneath the surface. Diplomatic envoys, increased visits to several African capitals. Security cooperation discussions intensified. Trade negotiators sharpened their language. History had shown that resource debates rarely remain theoretical. The stakes were too high. Late one evening, in a quiet corridor of the presidential palace, an aide asked Traore, "Are you worried?" He paused. "Change always creates friction," he replied. "But dependency creates stagnation." He looked out the window toward the city lights. "This is not about being praised or criticized. It is about ensuring that in 20 years, African children inherit factories, not just export ports." Across the continent, the youth were watching, not blindly supporting, not blindly opposing, but analyzing. For the first time in years, mineral policy had become dinner-table conversation. The debate was far from settled. Some nations would continue deeper integration with global powers under current frameworks. Others would renegotiate terms. Some would attempt hybrid models. Africa was not monolithic, and that perhaps was its strength. The storm that began with a quote had transformed into something larger. A continental audit of power. The world is not only watching Africa. Africa is watching itself. If you've reached this final chapter, then you understand. This was never about applause. It was about alignment. And now, the moment of decision had arrived. Months after the initial remarks from Washington, the dust had not settled, it had reorganized. Policy drafts across several African nations were no longer copies of old templates. They contained new clauses, local processing quotas, technology transfer requirements, public disclosure mechanisms, environmental reinvestment obligations. What began as debate had become paperwork, and paperwork changes history. At a Continental Economic Summit, hosted under the banner of the African Union, leaders gathered once more. Cameras flashed, diplomats whispered, investors observed carefully. This time, the tone was different, measured, strategic, not emotional. When Ibrahim Traoré took the podium, he did not reference praise from foreign presidents. He did not reference controversy. He spoke about leverage. "Africa supplies the raw materials powering the global green transition," he began. "Lithium, cobalt, manganese, gold. Yet too often, we remain at the lowest point of the value chain." He paused. "Partnership is welcome. Dependency is not." The room was silent, not hostile, not celebratory, attentive. Representatives from Nigeria defended their strategy, emphasizing infrastructure gains and market access under the leadership of Bola Ahmed Tinubu. Delegates from the Democratic Republic of Congo highlighted stability agreements under Félix Tshisekedi, arguing that structured foreign investment brings predictability. No one stormed out. No one shouted. Africa was debating Africa in public, professionally. That alone marked progress. Meanwhile, in Washington, advisors around Donald Trump recalibrated messaging. Officials clarified that U.S.-Africa cooperation would support mutual industrial development, signaling awareness that the narrative had shifted. Global powers understood something important. African audiences were no longer passive observers. They were scrutinizing every clause. Then came the symbolic moment. A coalition of 5 African countries announced the formation of a joint mineral processing initiative. Not anti-West, not anti-East, but Africa-led. The agreement did not reject foreign investors. It redefined their role. Foreign companies could participate, but refining would occur locally. Technology sharing would be mandatory. Revenue distribution would be transparent. It was not revolution. It was recalibration. On the streets of Ouagadougou, Lagos, Kinshasa, Nairobi, Accra, conversations continued. Some remained skeptical. Others were hopeful. Many were pragmatic. One university professor summarized it perfectly during a televised debate. "This is not about hero worship. It is about structural correction." Late one evening, back in Burkina Faso, Traoré addressed a small gathering of students. "You do not need to praise me," he told them. "You need to outthink dependency." He continued, "No leader saves a continent alone. Institutions do, citizens do, engineers do, entrepreneurs do." The room erupted in applause, not for confrontation, but for clarity. The story that began with a warning about Western praise ended with something more complex. A continent re-examining its contracts. A generation analyzing economics instead of just politics. Leaders forced to justify decisions not only to foreign partners but to their own people. History will judge each president differently. Some will be remembered for stability, some for negotiation, some for confrontation. But this chapter will be remembered for one thing. Africa asked harder questions, and once a population begins asking sharper economic questions, the rules change. In the final image of this story, no dramatic showdown, no collapse, no sudden victory, just meeting rooms filled with African negotiators reading every line twice. That is where real power shifts. Not in applause, not in praise, but in policy,